the creaking of heavy wooden doors, the murmur of restless spectators, the scent of polished oak and stale coffee lingering in the air. Inside this grand courtroom, a man stands accused, not because of evidence, but because of assumption. A judge, once seen as the ultimate authority, sits high on her bench, ready to deliver another ruling. But today, something is different. A presence enters the room. A man in a sharp black suit. A flash of a badge. A voice that will change everything. Justice has been delayed for too long. But today, the truth will finally be heard. If you believe in the power of truth, if you know that justice should never be a privilege but a right, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. Because stories like this remind us that no one is above the law, and together, we can shine a light on injustice. Bell turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The grand wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open, letting in the hushed murmurs of spectators and the shuffling of feet. The air was thick with the scent of polished oak and stale coffee, a reminder of the long hours spent deliberating justice, or at least, the illusion of it. At the center of it all stood James Carter, a 32-year-old black man, dressed in a well-worn navy blue suit. He carried himself with quiet dignity, but beneath his composed exterior was a man who knew all too well how unfair the system could be. He had been here before, not in this exact courtroom, but in places just like it, where men like him were judged before they even spoke. Accused of a crime with no solid evidence against him, he was forced to fight not just for his innocence, but for his very humanity. Presiding over the case was Judge Margaret Whitmore, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for being tough on crime, or rather, tough on defendants who looked like James. Beneath the guise of judicial decorum, she held deep-seated prejudices, making her courtroom less a place of justice and more a stage for predetermined outcomes. Standing beside James was Sarah Carter, his sharp, no-nonsense public defender. She knew the case was flimsy, but she also knew that in Whitmore's courtroom, fairness was never guaranteed. And then, the unexpected happened. Special Agent Thomas Carter walked in, his presence shifting the air in an instant. With a single statement, he would change everything. James Carter stood at the defendant's podium, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had been here before, not in this exact courtroom, but in places just like it, where the color of his skin spoke louder than any words he could say. He was accused of a petty theft, yet there was no solid evidence linking him to the crime. No fingerprints. No surveillance footage. Just the word of a store owner who said he looked like the suspect. Yet, as soon as Judge Margaret Whitmore laid eyes on him, her mind was made up. She barely acknowledged his lawyer's argument about the weak case. Instead, she eyed James with a look he had seen too many times before, one of quiet judgment, of assumption, of conviction without cause. When asked where he was on the night of the alleged crime, James answered truthfully, "At home, alone." The judge smirked. "Convenient," she muttered. Her skepticism wasn't about facts, it was about him. In that moment, James knew he wasn't just fighting a legal battle. He was fighting a system that had never been built for men like him to win. And despite his innocence, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him once again. Judge Margaret Whitmore sat high on her bench, her expression unreadable yet unmistakably cold. From the moment James Carter stepped into her courtroom, she had already formed her opinion. It wasn't based on evidence or legal precedent, it was based on something far more troubling: assumption. Her disdain was subtle but undeniable. The way her lips curled slightly when she looked at James. The impatient tapping of her fingers on the bench. The way she barely let his attorney, Sarah Carter, finish a sentence before dismissing her objections. Every gesture, every sigh, every condescending glance spoke volumes. When Sarah pointed out the lack of evidence, Judge Whitmore barely looked up. "And yet, here he is," she said dryly, as if James simply standing before her was proof enough of his guilt. The words stung. They weren't just dismissive, they were dangerous. She denied bail without hesitation, her decision final before the argument was even made. It wasn't justice, it was a performance. One where the outcome had been decided long before the case had even begun. To Judge Whitmore, James Carter wasn't an individual. He was a statistic, another case number, another man presumed guilty before he ever had the chance to prove otherwise. For people like James Carter, the courtroom was never a place of fairness, it was a battleground where the odds were already stacked against him. The American justice system, built on the principles of equality, too often failed the very people it was meant to protect. Instead of presuming innocence, it placed men like James under a microscope of suspicion. The case against him was weak. No fingerprints. No video footage. No credible witnesses. And yet, he stood before Judge Margaret Whitmore, facing the very real possibility of losing his freedom. Why? Because the system too often relied on assumptions rather than facts, on stereotypes rather than evidence. Public defenders like Sarah Carter fought tirelessly, but they were outnumbered and underfunded, going up against prosecutors who held all the power. Meanwhile, judges like Whitmore wielded their authority with little accountability, making decisions that could alter a person's life in an instant. James had no wealth, no influence, no connections. The system wasn't designed to favor men like him. And that was the harshest reality of all. Justice in America wasn't always about truth. Sometimes, it was about who had the privilege to be heard. The tension in the courtroom was thick, the air heavy with an unspoken understanding. This was not a trial about facts, but about power. Judge Margaret Whitmore sat high on her bench, prepared to deliver another ruling that had already been decided long before James Carter ever stepped foot in her courtroom. Then, the doors swung open. A man in a crisp black suit strode in with deliberate confidence. Special Agent Thomas Carter. At 6 feet 2 inches, with a broad frame and piercing gaze, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who was about to change everything. The room fell silent as he approached the bench, slipping his hand into his coat. The bailiff instinctively stiffened, but Carter wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a sleek black badge, raising it high enough for everyone to see. "Judge Whitmore," he said, his voice firm but calm. "By order of the FBI, I need you to step down from the bench immediately." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge's face, once full of smug certainty, flickered with the first hint of fear. For the first time in years, the woman who had sentenced so many without a second thought was now the one being judged. A stunned silence filled the courtroom as Special Agent Thomas Carter stepped forward, placing a thick folder onto Judge Margaret Whitmore's bench. The judge, once so confident, barely concealed the flicker of panic in her sharp blue eyes. "This," Carter said, tapping the folder, "is the result of months of investigation. Evidence proving that you, Judge Whitmore, have abused your position to wrongfully convict defendants, particularly black and minority individuals." He flipped the folder open, revealing pages of documents. "Here are the financial records," he continued, pulling out printed bank statements. "Large deposits into offshore accounts, all traced back to private donors, people with a vested interest in ensuring certain verdicts." Whitmore's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Carter reached for another document. "Sworn testimonies," he announced. "Witnesses who were coerced, defense attorneys who were silenced, and defendants who were sentenced based on fabricated or exaggerated charges." He turned to the bailiff, who now looked visibly uneasy. "And this," Carter said, holding up another sheet, "is proof of case rigging. Unexplained inconsistencies in sentencing, disproportionate rulings, and direct communications between you and prosecutors, discussions that should never have taken place. The weight of his words settled over the room. Spectators shifted uncomfortably, murmuring in disbelief. James Carter, still standing at the defense table, felt his pulse race. For so long, the system had worked against people like him. But today, the truth was finally seeing the light. Judge Whitmore's fingers gripped the edge of her bench, her knuckles whitening. For years, she had ruled from this very spot, untouchable. But now, the power she had wielded so freely was slipping through her fingers. For the first time, she was the one on trial. For years, Judge Margaret Whitmore had ruled her courtroom with an iron grip, her decisions final, her authority unquestioned. But today, the tides had turned. Special Agent Thomas Carter stood firm, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Judge Whitmore, you are under arrest for judicial misconduct, bribery, and obstruction of justice." A stunned silence fell over the room. Gasps echoed from the gallery. The bailiff, who had stood at her side for years, faltered, uncertain whether to protect her or step aside. The judge herself, usually composed and unshaken, now sat frozen, her grip tightening on the bench as if holding on to the last shred of control. "This is outrageous," she spat, her voice sharp with desperation. "I am the law in this courtroom." Carter remained unmoved. He pulled a federal arrest warrant from his coat and placed it in front of her. "Not anymore." The lead officer stepped forward. The entire courtroom held its breath as the officer reached for her wrists. The unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking shut rang through the room, a sound Whitmore had forced upon so many others, now echoing back at her. Spectators whispered in shock. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others, especially those who had suffered under her rulings, watched with quiet satisfaction. As she was led away, Whitmore turned, her eyes burning with fury. "This isn't over," she hissed. Carter met her gaze without flinching. "For you, it is." The doors swung shut behind her, and for the first time in her courtroom, true justice had finally been served. For James Carter, the moment felt surreal. Just minutes ago, he had stood in the defendant's chair, a man wrongly accused, fighting an uphill battle against a system that had never been fair to him. Now, the very judge who had dismissed his defense, who had all but condemned him without evidence, was being led away in handcuffs. Special Agent Thomas Carter turned toward James, his expression firm but reassuring. "Mr. Carter, you're free to go." James blinked, processing the words. His attorney, Sarah Carter, exhaled sharply, her shoulders finally relaxing. "The case against you was built on lies, just like so many others under Whitmore's rulings," she said. "Your record will be cleared." The weight James had carried, of fear, of injustice, of being judged before he even spoke, began to lift. He nodded slowly, his voice steady but filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." As he stepped away from the defense table, the room remained silent for a moment. Then, one person clapped. Another followed. Within seconds, the entire courtroom erupted, not just for James, but for every person who had ever been wronged before him. For once, justice had truly prevailed. For years, Judge Margaret Whitmore had ruled from her high bench, wielding her gavel like a weapon. She believed she was untouchable, that her courtroom was her kingdom, and her word was law. She had sentenced countless men and women with little regard for fairness, confident that no one would ever challenge her authority. But justice has a way of catching up, even with the powerful. As she sat in stunned silence, wrists bound in cold steel, reality came crashing down. The very laws she had twisted to suit her prejudices had now turned against her. Special Agent Thomas Carter had made it clear, no one, not even a judge, is above the law. The courtroom that once feared her now watched in disbelief. Some gasped. Others whispered in hushed voices. A few, particularly those who had suffered under her rulings, let quiet satisfaction flicker across their faces. Power unchecked is dangerous. But today, the system corrected itself. Her gavel lay abandoned on the bench, useless now. The final judgment had been made, not by her, but against her. As she was led away, the lesson was undeniable: titles do not grant immunity, and even those who sit in judgment must one day answer for their own sins. For men like James Carter, patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a necessity. He had spent his entire life walking carefully, knowing that one wrong move, one misplaced word, could be used against him. When he was accused of a crime he didn't commit, he wasn't just fighting for his innocence, he was fighting against a system that had never given him the benefit of the doubt. Standing in that courtroom, he knew the odds were stacked against him. Judge Margaret Whitmore had already decided his fate before he even spoke. The prosecution had built its case on assumptions rather than facts. And the system? It had seen countless men like him before and rarely ruled in their favor. But James didn't lash out. He didn't crumble. He held on. Because deep down, he knew something powerful: the truth, no matter how long it takes, will always rise to the surface. And it did. When Special Agent Thomas Carter walked into that courtroom, the weight of corruption finally collapsed. The same judge who had treated James as just another case number was now the one in handcuffs. The system that had failed him was now correcting itself in real time. For those who have been wronged, justice may feel distant. But James Carter's story proves one thing: if you stand firm in the truth, no matter how long the fight, justice will always find a way. Life has a way of testing us, especially when we are faced with injustice. Many of us grew up believing that fairness was the foundation of society, that the legal system existed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But as time goes on, we see that justice isn't always immediate. Sometimes, it is delayed. Sometimes, it is denied. And sometimes, it takes the courage of just a few determined individuals to set things right. The story of James Carter is a reminder that while injustice exists, it does not have to define us. In the face of false accusations, he did not allow anger to consume him. He held on to patience, dignity, and the unshakable belief that the truth would one day prevail. And when the moment came, when the corrupt judge who had ruled against so many was finally exposed, justice was served, not just for him, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. This lesson is not just about the courtroom, it's about life. We all face moments where we are unfairly judged, dismissed, or overlooked. It's easy to feel powerless, to believe that the system is too broken to change. But history has shown us that truth is stronger than lies, and integrity is more powerful than corruption. So, whether in our personal lives or in the broader world, let us remember, patience is not weakness, and standing for what is right, no matter how long it takes, will always be worth it.